They say everything in life has a price, especially if you steal something that's older than death itself. We reached for treasures forged in an eternity of 2 billion years. And in doing so, we turned the FBI into a worldwide laughingstock. Everyone expected us to rot in a cell. But do you know what the heist of the century actually costs? I'm going to tell you how to trade priceless relics for your freedom, and why sometimes justice costs no more than a cheap one-way ticket. We didn't break the alarm. We broke the belief that the system always wins. People knew me as Jack Murphy, though the headlines had a different name for me: Murph the Surf. I wasn't just another guy with a surfboard. I was the man who decided that the ocean wasn't enough, and that the stars in the museum belonged in my pocket. And this is my story. You know the problem with an ideal life? Sooner or later you get used to it, like an old pair of sneakers. Miami was my kingdom, the sun that never sets and the ocean. Oh, that ocean. I knew every wave, every whim of the tide. But that day, lying on the scorching sand, I suddenly felt a strange sense of suffocation. The ocean became too tight for me, like a child's bathtub. I needed an element of a different scale. I was lazily flipping through an old issue of Life magazine, and then my fingers froze. From the glossy page, the abyss stared back at me, a deep, cold blue, the star of India. 563 carats. The article screamed that this treasure was the most guarded in the world, that its walls were impenetrable, and its alarms were perfection itself. I stared at the photo and remembered the facts. This sapphire is about 2 billion years old. It formed deep within the Earth's crust, when there wasn't even a hint of life on the planet. It watched oceans being born and vanishing. And now it had become my challenge. I jumped up from my lounge chair, crumpling the magazine in my fist, and ran to the guys. Boys, Brahman, forget about the waves. I exhaled. We're going to New York. We're taking the Star of India, and everything that glitters next to it. We had no plan, no tools, just absolute, pure recklessness. New York greeted us with a piercing cold that bit to the bone after the Florida heat. For several days, like ghosts, we wandered through the halls of the Museum of Natural History, blending in with the noisy crowds of tourists and schoolchildren. But when our footsteps finally went silent at the threshold of the Morgan Hall, the reality around us simply switched off. The Star of India dominated the space. A stone the size of a chicken egg radiated a strange, almost hypnotic glow, and inside it, as if trapped, sat a milky white six-pointed star. I gazed into that blueness, remembering every word from that article. 3 centuries ago, it was mined in Sri Lanka. Its main trick, asterism, allowed the star to shine from both sides of the stone, making it one of a kind. A little further away, like a clump of frozen flame, the DeLong star ruby caught my eye. Those 100 carats of deep red looked like a drop of fresh blood on snow. But the real shock for me was the Black Star of Queensland. This cold, dark mass, weighing 733 carats, had an almost comical history. It was hard to believe that in Australia, an ordinary family had used this treasure as a doorstop for years, never guessing that a fortune lay beneath their feet. Sizing up the brilliance, I quickly did the math in my head. We were preparing to walk out with over $400,000 worth of items. In '64, for that kind of money, you could buy more than just a life. you could buy your own small country. We frantically searched for a weak spot, and I almost laughed out loud at what I saw. The massive windows, right under the ceiling, were simply left open for ventilation. The museum was so arrogant that it turned its own grandeur into our main advantage. No laser grids, no sensitive sensors, just a naked faith in the thickness of the walls. Our arsenal for the heist of the century looked ridiculous. A coil of rope, a couple of flashlights, and a cheap glass cutter for 50 cents. I looked at the Star of India again. This sapphire, already 2 billion years old, had seen tectonic plates shift and mountains be born. And now, it just waited behind thin glass, while 3 bold surfers came to take it into eternity. Night in New York smelled of cold iron and our own fear. We climbed the icy wall to the height of the 4th floor, and every movement echoed in my temples like a heavy hammer. When I finally vaulted over the windowsill and dropped to the floor, the silence in the Morgan Hall felt deafening, almost physical. It was so thick, you could almost cut it with a knife. We found ourselves in a true kingdom of shadows. Around us loomed the skeletons of dinosaurs, whose empty eye sockets seemed to watch our every step. There were no alarms on the display cases. The museum management believed too much in the invincibility of their walls, and that vanity played right into our hands. My hands trembled as I reached for my flashlight. But then, our first surprise, the beam of light flickered and died. Batteries were dead. At the exact moment when everything was on the line, our professional arsenal failed us. We had to work almost blindly, lighting our way with short bursts from cheap lighters. I pressed the 50-cent glass cutter against the display. A thin, unbearable screech rang out. In the nightly void, it sounded to me like a scream across all of Manhattan. And in that same second, from deep in the corridor, came a rhythmic echo, the footsteps of a guard. We froze into the floor, literally dissolving into the shadow of a giant diplodocus. My heart hammered so hard I was afraid the guy with the flashlight would hear it. He passed by. As soon as the sound of footsteps faded, I pushed out the glass. First was the Star of India. When I touched it, the cold burned my fingers. The heavy stone settled into my palm, and for a moment I froze, feeling the weight of billions of years of history. Next, the Black Star of Queensland went into my pocket. We emptied the cases one by one, taking everything. Rubies, diamonds, emeralds. I stuffed them into my trouser pockets, feeling those icy treasures bang against my legs with every step. We were carrying out eternity in the ordinary pockets of surfer jackets. The descent nearly turned fatal. Halfway to the ground, the rope suddenly went slack. Our hastily tied knot hadn't held. I swung out, and for a heartbeat hung over the night city, clinging to the wall with one hand. Below me was only the empty sidewalk and the darkness. My muscles screamed from the strain, but the rush, that sweet and dangerous drug, whispered right in my ear, "Not today, Jack. Just not today." I suddenly realized, if I fall, I won't even be remembered. But if I live, we will be told of. We touched the asphalt and just walked away, trying to breathe steadily, like a pair of friends who had simply stayed at a bar until morning. In a cheap hotel room on the outskirts, we could finally exhale. I simply emptied my pockets onto the bed, and a dry, crystalline sound rang out. The treasures spilled onto the dirty bedspread, In the light of a single dim bulb, they looked like chunks of frozen cosmos. We picked through them with trembling fingers, like children with candy. On that bed lay over $410,000, a fortune that could provide us with a luxurious life until old age. Among the blue and red glints, the eagle diamond stood out. It had an unusual, warm yellow hue that reminded me of the sun over Miami. Holding it, I remembered how a farmer from Wisconsin accidentally pulled this stone from the ground while digging a regular well in 1876. Next to it burned the DeLong Star ruby, 100 carats of thick red. We looked at this haul and felt like the masters of the world. But that was the exact moment we made our biggest mistake. When you hold eternity in your hands, a real oxygen deprivation begins. You lose touch with reality. We started throwing around the cash, as if we had already fenced the stones. Expensive steaks, the best bars in Manhattan, taxis at every turn. We acted like we'd hit the jackpot in a casino, not robbed the most famous museum in the country. We forgot that New York isn't the open ocean. There were predators here, and we led them straight to our door. I smelled trouble on the third day, looking out the window, and then into the taxi's rearview mirror. I saw 3 police cars. The sirens weren't wailing yet, but they were already blocking our path. In that moment, I knew the game was over. They say that in a panic, we flushed some of the smaller stones down the toilet. Perhaps a part of the treasures that survived billions of years ended its journey in the sewers of New York. When we returned to Miami, I already knew. They were watching us. They weren't hiding. They weren't rushing. They were just staying half a step behind, letting us feel the leash. And you know what? We didn't run. The true thrill of stories like this isn't the moment of the theft. It's not even the triumph. It begins when someone's hand is tightening around your throat, and you suddenly realize that the hand doing the squeezing is shaking more than you are. The press was going wild. The Star of India was gone. The most famous museum in the country looked like a stage set after a bad magic trick. 3 guys in board shorts had outplayed a system that had considered itself infallible for years. It was a public humiliation, and it had to be fixed. Fast. The first interrogation took place in a room with no windows, a table, a lamp, 2 agents trying to look calm. One of them kept spinning a pencil in his hands, too fast, too nervously. They talked about decades, about federal prison. I listened and stayed silent, because at that moment, I wasn't thinking about sentences. I was thinking about a storage locker at the Miami bus station, about a metal door, about a $2 lock, about billions of years, tucked between old towels and strangers' suitcases. And that's when I realized the most important thing. They didn't know. They didn't ask how we did it. They didn't ask why we dared. They only asked one thing: where? Which meant the game was still on. The following weeks were like a chess match without a clock. They made a move. We stayed silent. They raised the stakes. We stayed silent again. I saw their palms sweating. How they weren't angry at us, but at their own helplessness. The stones were more important to them than our lives, and that was our trump card. We weren't bargaining for freedom. We were bargaining for time. A month for a hint, a year for a direction. I didn't rush, because I knew. Every day without the Star of India cost them more than every day of our imprisonment. At some point, they broke. A different man just walked in, sat down, put the papers on the table. I looked at him, and, for the first time, I smiled. Because I knew. The final terms hadn't been voiced yet, which meant we were still leading. Here lies the main secret of this story. Do you know how much 2 billion years actually cost? I do. We struck a deal that made the prosecutor's eye twitch. We gave them back the blue sapphire. We handed over the midnight star. We let them find the DeLong Star ruby in a phone booth. After 10 long months of waiting. In exchange for this, we got only 3 years. 3 years for the heist of the century. It wasn't prison. It was a vacation we bought, using the treasures of eternity. The authorities got their display cases back, and we got our freedom and the status of legends. But the eagle diamond, that predatory yellow eye, never returned to the glass. When the feds pressed me against the wall asking about it, I just shrugged. They say we sawed it up. They say it vanished into private collections. But I think a stone that survived billions of years simply didn't want to be an exhibit again. Today I'm looking at the ocean again. Everyone thinks we're losers who got caught. But sitting here, under the Miami sun, I know for sure we are the only ones who managed to outplay time. We held eternity in our hands. We gave them just enough to walk out while we were still young. But something that couldn't be tracked, remains forever where no protocol can find it. And the eagle diamond? Who knows? Maybe it's staring at you right now from the darkness of someone's safe deposit box, or from the depths of my memory. There's only one question left. Would you be willing to give up 3 years of your life to be the owner of the entire world for just one moment?